Welcome everyone. We'll give everyone time to get in here. We'd like to welcome you. Thank you for joining us tonight. We'll give it a minute or so before we get started, but we definitely want to welcome you all this evening. We are excited. We have a very exciting program tonight. Very exciting. And it's okay to engage in the chat. If you want to say where you're from, you can go ahead and put that in the chat while people are coming in. I love it. I love it. Awesome. And now we will start. Welcome everyone to this evening's discussion tonight. You will meet the authors of We're Better Than This, My Fight for the Future of Our Democracy. They will be introduced to you as we go further into the program. During the course of tonight's discussion, you can place your questions or any questions that you have in the Q&A. And then as soon as the discussions are close to the end, we will go ahead and go through the Q&A and go through those questions. Please keep in mind that the Denver Public Library will have other programs around Black History this month, and they are listed in the chat. We will go ahead and put those in the chat for you. And you can also click on there to join our programs. And we also, before we start, want to give a huge thank you to the Book Bar for promoting this wonderful program. Their information is also listed in the chat. So we are going to also put that in the chat so you can find out more information about the Book Bar. Now, let's introduce tonight's moderator. Tonight's moderator is Dr. Derek Hudson. Dr. Derek Hudson is a teaching associate professor in humanities, arts, and social sciences at Colorado School of Mines. He holds a PhD in international relations from the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Some of Dr. Hudson's academic interests includes African politics, African American studies, ethnic studies, international politics, political theory, political risk, urban studies, religious studies, and religion and politics in South Africa. In the nonprofit world, Dr. Hudson was part of the formation of the Issachar Center for Urban Leadership and Urban Studies and Leadership program designed to train indigenous leadership for urban neighborhoods in Denver. Dr. Hudson has taught at the University of Michigan, Metropolitan State University of Denver, University of Colorado, Denver, Colorado Christian University, and American Pathways University. At Mines, Dr. Hudson has taught in the Guy T. McBride Honors Program and is part of the graduate faculty in Natural Resources and Energy Policy, and has been a Daniels Faculty Fellow in Ethics. Dr. Hudson's most recent book focuses on post-successionist dynamics in South Sudan and the challenge of governance in South Sudan. Dr. Hudson's current research is centered in the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and now its completion will be a game changer for the Nile River Basin, riparian water countries in Eastern Africa. So please put your hands together and hearts together for Dr. Derek Hudson.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to just express my sincere thanks for allowing me to participate as a moderator and to really just have us pause and to really honor the life and legacy of Elijah Cummings. I'd like to read a couple of quotes to you from one of my intellectual heroes, Nell Irving Painter. And the book that I'm holding in my hand is a book I often use when I teach African American history, title called Creating Black Americans, African American History and Its Meanings in 1619 to the Present. And here's what she says and why I would like to just sort of start us to sort of settle in on what she's trying to convey to us. Contrary to what many people assume, history exists in two time frames, the past and the present. It is tempting to conclude that what happened in the past is over and done with, utterly unchanging despite the passage of time. But when you think about how much happens in individual lives, in the lives of peoples and nations, you realize that in order to make sense of what took place, you need to select what is important from all the other trivial things that happened in the past. At any given point, this selection takes place in the present. We have to select because if we do not pull out what is important, the past remains a confusing, meaningless morass of detail. Making sense of the past is the work of historians who create historical narrative. Historical narrative constructs a coherent story that makes sense to us now. Historical narrative endows certain people and events with historical importance and denies historical importance to other people and events. So today we are highlighting the life and legacy of Elijah Cummings. I think what a great title to this conversation. This was his iconic line, "We can do better." So I think what we're going to hear tonight is what he meant by that. As we listen to our two speakers tonight, really unpack that for us. And just, I'm so anxious once they're done. What's really on my mind and heart is what would Elijah Cummings be saying about this moment that we are currently in. We are in, and I don't think it's hyperbole, one of the most disordered places of upheaval in American history. And I could go on and on about that, but I'm just the moderator, so I will not do that. But I do think it's so important to think about who this man was, what he stood for, and how he might sort of be guiding us now as we're trying to figure out where we're headed in this present moment moving forward. So we have two outstanding guests who have agreed to spend some time with us, and let me go ahead and introduce them to you. The first is Dr. Maya Rockymore Cummings. She is a social entrepreneur, speaker, writer, and strategist who is on a mission to drive society toward inclusion. After a quarter of a century of working on innovative public policy and multi-million-dollar social change initiatives in the government, nonprofit, and private sectors, Maya is a policy and political expert who understands how to build and sustain cross-sector collaborations, diverse coalitions, dynamic diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies, and effective election campaigns. An accomplished public speaker and author, Maya has appeared in a variety of media outlets such as CBS, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and BET, and her writings have been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Huffington Post, and the Washington Post, among other publications. She has served on numerous boards, including the National Association of Counties Financial Services Corporation, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, and the National Academy of Social Insurance. She is a recipient of multiple honors, such as the Aspen Institute Henry Crown Fellowship Award, and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Fellowship Award, and has been a candidate for Maryland governor and the U.S. Congress. A former chair of the Maryland Democratic Party, Meyer earned her BA in political science from Prairie View A&M University and her MA and PhD in political science with an emphasis in public policy from Purdue University. She is the widow of the late Congressman Elijah E. Cummings and lives in West Baltimore with her dog, Andy. Our other guest today is James Dale, and has been the author collaborator on a number of books on topics including business, medicine, and life lessons. His works include The Power of Nice with agent negotiator Ron Shapiro, Just Show Up with Hall of Fame baseball player Cal Ripken Jr., and The Q Factor with Super Bowl winning coach Brian Billick. So without any further ado, I would like to invite Maya to begin with, I think, the sort of the inspiration for why you wanted to write this book.
Thank you, Dr. Hudson, and thank you to the Denver Public Library. We are absolutely at a critical moment in the history, not just of this country, but of the world. And Dr. Hudson, I thank you for your opening salvo that, you know, what are we to make of this moment? We are, of course, fresh off the heels of the second impeachment process, resulting in the second acquittal of Donald J. Trump. We've got indications that those who participated in the January 6th insurrection are certainly being investigated by the FBI. But the question becomes is, what does Donald Trump do from here? And what does this mean for the future of our democracy? With that, I want to say that, you know, it was my honor and privilege to be married to the late Congressman Elijah Cummings for 11 and a half, almost 12 years. And he was not just my partner in life, he was my best friend, confidant, certainly a strategist for me and I for him. And so with that, 8 years ago, I asked him to think about writing a book and tried to find a way to get it done for him. And we finally, one day I was having lunch with a colleague and I was lamenting that I had yet to find somebody to help Elijah write his book. And she said, I have a friend and this is what he does. And that friend happened to be James Dale. Now I contacted Jim, we met, I thought he was great. I introduced him to Elijah, they met, and then they hit it off. And so the rest is history. So I can't tell you how many times that I've had friends and colleagues who knew Elijah and have read this book say, I feel like he's speaking to me when I read the book. And that is a testament, I think, to Jim's skill and his talent as a collaborative author. I would also like to say that we're very pleased that this book has been nominated for 2 NAACP Image Awards in their literary category. And in one category, we're up against another awesome author named former President Barack Obama. So with that, I would love to turn it over to James Dale for the next segment.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Maya. And thank you, Dr. Hudson. Certainly, your introduction is so appropriate because where we like to lead with this kind of session is from the text of the book into where we are today. And really so much of what Elijah did and stood for was precursor to today and would be helpful to us today. So as Maya said, we got together. She was the matchmaker and put me together with Elijah, and we did have a remarkable match quickly. We clicked with each other, and I like to say the first session we had, he had booked me for a half an hour on his calendar. Very busy man, and I figured I would stay until he threw me out, and that was not for another 3 hours. So we realized we had something going. And I do want to say one thing, and that is that I've written books like this, that is collaborating with people, well-known people accomplished in their fields for many, many years, for over 2 decades. But I say without qualifier, that personally, this book and this particular project, this collaboration, was the single most meaningful and moving and indelible experience of my writing life. It will be with me forever. I will tell you about the process a little bit, that we had session after session where Elijah would tell me stories. And from those stories, they were from his youth, from his growing up, from going to school, from various experiences he had. And from those stories, I began to formulate a structure for the book that was a quilted sort of interweaving of these formative moments of his past, the child of sharecroppers, living in segregated neighborhoods, struggling in school, those kind of moments forming the fabric of everything that he was able to do in later life, in Washington and Congress, with presidents. The past was truly informing the future, the present and future. Very early in our writing sessions, I asked Elijah a question that actually I referred to later as an unfair question, which is there one story that rises above the rest, that stands out as being perhaps most formative in your life? And without hesitation, he said, yes, there is one. And he recounted the following experience, and I'm going to read an excerpt from that story. When I was no more than 11 years old, my life was forever altered. I certainly didn't realize it at the time. I knew something important was happening, but it took a long while before the impact really hit me. We had a neighborhood community playground center where the kids would gather in the summer with a small wading pool and some recreation counselors to watch over us. Our little wading pool was no more than a few feet across and very shallow, maybe up to your knees, and filled with kids side by side. You had to take turns a half hour at a time. And after the third group, the water was pretty dirty, but that was the only way we had to get cool on a hot day. One day in late August, a lady came and asked us kids, how would you like to go to a real swimming pool, one with a diving board, an Olympic-sized pool? Well, we all thought that would be great, but how was that going to happen? She said there was a pool like that only a few blocks away from where we were, in Riverside Park, and that we deserved to go there, and she was going to take us. She said, quote, you can swim to your heart's delight. Those were her words almost 50 years ago, to your heart's delight. Her name was Juanita Jackson Mitchell. And to us, she was just this nice lady who was going to take us to a real swimming pool. We didn't realize until later that she was a civil rights pioneer from a family of civil rights pioneers, and the first African-American woman to practice law in Maryland. Juanita Jackson Mitchell's mother was the inspirational Dr. Lily Jackson, who descended from a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but still had to attend the segregated colored high school. She rose to president of the Baltimore branch of the NAACP, became an early leader in nonviolent protest, and was known as the Mother of Freedom. Her daughter, Juanita, was married to Clarence Mitchell Jr., a national leader in civil rights and lobbyist for the NAACP. And they were the parents of two state senators, Michael and Clarence III. Civil rights was practically the family business. What Mrs. Mitchell did not tell us that day about the nice pool she was taking us to was that it was totally segregated. No blacks allowed. She and her colleagues at the rec center, Jim Smith and Walter Black, were leading us on an integration march. There we were, a band of little kids walking down the streets of Baltimore, from a black neighborhood to a white neighborhood, only a few blocks from each other, but worlds apart. Day after day, Juanita and Jim and Walter led about 30 of us, walking 10 or 15 blocks, while an angry mob, not of other kids, but of grown white adults, yelled names at us, told us to go home, and threw rocks and bricks at little kids. One of those rocks struck me in the forehead and caused a scar that I carry to this day. The police watched and the newspapers took pictures and ran stories, but nobody stopped the angry residents. And nobody stopped us. We kids would swim in the Riverside Park pool each day and then leave with quote unquote neighbors yelling racial epithets and throwing debris and bottles, and white kids pushing black kids in the pool. I call them neighbors, ironically, Yes, we all lived within blocks of each other, but they were hardly neighborly. They were the opposite, people trying to keep us out of their neighborhood. Tensions were high. After taking Sunday off, they let us all back again on Monday, Labor Day. That day, someone called Walter's associate, Lyle Roberts, a nigger, the hostility escalating. But about that time, the Riverside Park citizens, clinging to their segregated white enclave, must have realized that we were all going to just keep coming back, because they stopped coming to their doorways and out into the streets, shouting and throwing rocks. As Juanita Mitchell promised, we all got to go to a real pool, and as she said, we swam to our heart's delight. Even as little children, we had a sense of victory and fear. We had gone off to play every day, but we ended up making history. That was in the early 1960s, and old rules and practices and even prejudices began slowly but steadily to change. Baltimore stayed largely segregated for the next 10 years, but it was the beginning, the root of what would evolve into a massive upheaval in social norms, change. For me, that was the beginning of wanting to become somebody who could make things change. I saw that Mitchell and the other people who made segregation happen were lawyers. So I wanted to be a lawyer. These lawyers were young men and women who had the courage to walk up the streets and have people yell at them and be unafraid. To have little kids following them, trusting and believing in them. To make change happen. I wasn't sure what a lawyer was, what their job was, but I saw what they could accomplish. Oh my God, what a powerful force that could be. Change. Little black children getting what only white children had because we were, after all, just kids, no matter what color, who wanted the same chances in life. The chance to swim in a pool, the chance to go to a good school or live in a nice neighborhood or see a better world. I wanted to be part of that change. And I have endeavored to do so ever since. And I have pursued it ever since. As for progress in achieving change, here's a fitting postscript. 30 years later, a man came up and identified himself as one of those in the angry mob. And he told me he was sorry. What is the right response to justice acknowledged, but so long delayed? I did not applaud his admission, nor did I spurn it. I said, apology accepted. Elijah said to me as we were writing this book that he never forgot the swimming pool incident. It was formative. He said he often called upon the memory of it to fuel his actions. When he conducted hearings on the Trump immigration policies, separating mothers and children, putting them in cages, telling them to, quote, go back where they came from. When Trump launched his Twitter attack on Cummings' beloved hometown as a, quote, disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess. When Elijah answered ABC's George Stephanopoulos' question, yes, Trump is a racist, no doubt about it. When Elijah walked the streets of Baltimore to calm his city after the senseless death of Freddie Gray. At Freddie's funeral, when he asked those watching and listening, did you see him? Did you really see him? You see him in the casket. You see him on the news. But when he walked to school, when he played ball on his neighborhood team, when he sang in the choir, did you see him? Elijah Cummings decried the invisible black lives so often lost, never really seen. It's stories like this that became the fabric that interwove his life and mission. And now Maya, his wife and partner, who wrote the last chapter of the book, will talk about that final chapter and bring us up to date as well with recent events. Maya.
Thank you, Jim. And just so everyone in the viewing audience knows, Elijah went on to become one of the first cohorts of African Americans to integrate, the first cohort of African Americans to integrate Baltimore City Public Schools. He graduated with honors from one of its most prestigious high schools, went on to graduate from Howard University, Phi Beta Kappa, went on to attend the University of Maryland Law School, where he graduated in 3 years, passed the bar on the first time, became a state of Maryland House of Delegates representative before being elected to the United States Congress, and of course, rising to become one of the most powerful members of that body as the chairman of the Oversight and Reform Committee. Now, that event of what happened at the pool showed him the possibility of people power in a democracy. How if you actually press the levers of law, press the levers of protest, the 5 freedoms in the Constitution, that you could actually make a transformative difference in the lives of many people. And so with that, it served as a springboard for the rest of his life and for his career. So I'm going to read a section from my piece of the book, the last chapter, the epilogue, if you will. And then we're going to talk about what's happening in current times. After the Democrats regained the majority in the midterms, Elijah was the chairman of the Committee on Oversight and Reform. Elijah was finally in a position to lead investigations and to set the agenda for hearings. But he was sober about the realities of the threats he and his committee would face from the Trump administration and congressional Republicans. Despite his pain, he threw himself into his work. Then, in late summer, just before his speech at the National Press Club, he took yet another bad turn and was readmitted to Johns Hopkins. The underlying suspicion was that the cancer had come back. Elijah was weaker than I'd seen him in years. A day before he was to give the speech, I asked if he still intended to do it. He said, "Maya, I'll be there if I have to crawl." Elijah was so drained that when his aides maneuvered him to the podium, pale and unsteady, I thought he might drop. Then he looked at the crowd, 4 or 5 times the size of what had been expected, before his investigations into the administration, before the shootings in Dayton and El Paso, and before Trump's Twitter attack on Baltimore and Elijah. He looked at the crowd and you could see him become energized. He exhorted the audience to listen and, more important, to take action. He was passionate as only Elijah Cummings could be. The gathering of usually callous Washington media cheered and gave him a standing ovation. Exhausted and barely able to keep going, he went straight back to the hospital. During the next few weeks, he managed to continue vital work. He was on the phone with Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, Jerry Nadler, and his staff. He read testimony. He reviewed the impeachment updates. He signed subpoenas. So many times I said, "Elijah, that's enough for today." "Okay, I'll stop soon," he'd say. Doctors at Hopkins and the NIH monitored his cancer. It was obviously recurring. The question was, could they do anything to slow it down or limit it? We all did everything we could. There became, I think the best word is, an inevitability to it. He knew and I suspected we were coming to the end. It was coming as if you could see it like a train approaching in the distance. When you're not sure how far away it is, but you know it's steadily coming towards you. That's when he began to talk differently. He would say he was tired, no matter how much rest he got, just tired all the time. He complained of constant pain. It was clearly physical, but it was also emotional and spiritual. The inner Elijah was burning out. We talked about the past, what Elijah had done, and about the future and all that remained to be done. But we did not use the word death. We just knew. As if sped by his passing, events moved even faster in the days just after Elijah's death. On December 18, 2019, Speaker Nancy Pelosi banged the gavel and announced that the House of Representatives voted 230 to 197, strictly along party lines, to impeach President Donald J. Trump, the 3rd president in the history of the United States to face impeachment charges. That evening, during her press conference, she spoke about Elijah. She honored him as a key force in the inquiry, calling him our North Star. And she quoted him, "When the history books are written about this tumultuous era, I want them to show that I was among those in the House of Representatives who stood up to lawlessness and tyranny." She added, he also said somewhat presciently, "When we're dancing with angels, the question will be, what did you do to make sure we kept our democracy intact?" We did all we could, Elijah. We passed the 2 articles of impeachment. The president is impeached. As I often told people in the days after his death, Elijah's death wasn't just my loss, it was our loss as a nation. And we all have the responsibility to move his legacy forward, because we know that with every transgression, every disregard for the Constitution, every attempt to act above the law, every denial of truth, our democracy is endangered. That's why in the months and years ahead, we must continue to hear Elijah's voice. We're better than this. We're better than this. Yes, we are. We must be. Now, Dr. Hudson asked at the beginning, what did he mean by we're better than this? I think that it was both aspirational, something that we need to aspire to as a country, to be better than this moment in time that we found ourselves in, to be better than our past, frankly. We're better than this, I think he also meant inspirationally, to challenge people to aspire and to be inspired to do better in their daily walk and certainly in their politics. So Elijah's words and his deeds were prescient, perhaps more so than he would have wished. Since his passing, we have lived through basically historic moments, moments that will be written in history books 100 years and more from now. From the first impeachment charges to the partisan acquittal, to the COVID pandemic and its botched response, Elijah would not have been surprised by that. To the ugly presidential campaign, thankfully to the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, to Trump's false claims of winning a stolen election and his loyalists claiming it was stolen, to their outrageous and fraudulent lawsuits claiming voter fraud, to the dismissal of all, I think more than 30 of those suits, to state election officials, even Republican officials denying the president's election lies. Bill Barr and Chris Christie both even rejected the fraud claims. But to the complicity of over 100 members of the United States House of Representatives seeking to overturn the Electoral College votes for Biden and Harris, to Trump's, turning on his own vice president, and then, of course, inciting a violent insurrection on the US Capitol on January 6th. So the question becomes, and I get this question often, what would Elijah have thought? What would he have done? And he tells us in his book what he would have thought. There is a segment where he actually says, quote, "Democracy literally means a government run by the people. People don't always agree, but to get anywhere, especially in the polarizing arena of politics, we have to find common ground, somewhere, something to build trust and respect on. You also have to teach people that you have boundaries, bottom lines, things that you will not do, behaviors that you will not put up with, places that you will not go. As in a democracy, having your own checks and balances teaches our friends as well as our leaders what we will and will not accept." Elijah would have seen January 6th and everything leading up to it as completely unacceptable. He would have decried, certainly the events that took place on January 6th. And certainly he would have been up front in the Senate impeachment hearing, declaring and asking the senators to please convict, please get out of your partisanship, get out of the cult of personality, and recognize that our country deserves better, that our children deserve better, and certainly that we can do better by certainly convicting Donald Trump and preventing him from ever running for public office again. And so, Elijah, of course, would have been disappointed in the outcome, as am I. But, you know, Dr. Hudson asked a question in the beginning, and the question is, where are we right now in this moment in our nation's history? And we are at a similar moment that we found ourselves in during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. I think where, you know, certainly African Americans, you know, at that time were able to enter public life, some members becoming African Americans becoming members of the United States Congress and entering the US Senate, African Americans voting in large numbers across the country, including the South, just getting on their feet to get educated, and then having the wool and the rug pulled out from under them in the Compromise of 1877, which resulted in the South, the Southern sentiment, then prevailing for the next 100 years through the advancement of Jim Crowism, where all those rights that were advanced in the Civil Rights Act of that mid to late 1800s being actually taken back, rolled back, with separate and unequal being the practice and the law of the land. And certainly we saw mid-century of the 20th century, African Americans rising to challenge the Jim Crow laws and winning with the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which finally resulted in the broad and widespread right to vote by both African American men and women. And so, you know, what we've seen over, you know, the past now 55 plus years has been advancements, you know, in education and science and the labor market and government, you know, all of these things. But what we also see are demographic shifts that the scientists show scare a lot of people, particularly white people. And a series of studies have shown that when presented with the evidence of the nation's changing racial and ethnic makeup, white people of all political persuasions, liberal, moderate, and conservative, all swing to the right. Now, that series of articles ran in the New York Times in 2015 in the lead up to the 2016 election. I always believe that Donald Trump actually read those articles and formulated his strategy about Make America Great Again, appealing to all those people who were fearful about having a multiracial democracy, about losing a country that had been basically structured around white privilege. And so what we're seeing now is an effort to retrench, to take our nation back 100 years, and to basically have our children and their children relitigate the past 100 years all over again if this regressionist movement it actually succeeds. We see that the regressionist movement has actually captured many members of the US House and Senate and many people across the country. Certainly it's nothing to sneeze at that Donald Trump received 74 million votes in this last election. And so we are in the battle for the future of our democracy. Will we embrace a diverse, equitable, and inclusive future? Or will we allow the politics of this era to take us back in time, back to a country that is intolerant of diversity, that seeks to actually privilege white supremacy and to deny people of diverse backgrounds opportunities in this country? And I am here to tell you that it's up to us. It's what all of us do at this moment in time. It's about whether we become educated and we stay engaged. It's about whether we put our foot to the pedal and the metal to make sure that the Biden-Harris administration does the right thing, but that we also turn out in midterm elections and also the next presidential elections and every election in between at the local and state level to actually move politics forward and not backward. And with that, I will stop and I will open it up, Dr. Hudson, for wherever you want to take us.
All right. Well, thank you so very much for those very convicting words, words to, as you say, to both. I may need to have you clarify what you said earlier, that Elijah's words were both inspirational and aspirational. Is that what you said?
Absolutely.
Right. And the reason why I really resonate with that, because you know, I mean, we are, I mean, the way that Maya just really sort of put it there for us to see, we are at an 1877 moment. That's how important it is. Because, in fact, my first question, but I want to make sure I'm checking in the chat and into the Q&A, and you can begin to populate those two so I can begin to get questions to both Maya and James. My first thought was I was thinking of Dr. Vincent Harding, and I was mentored by him. I had the real privilege to be mentored by him when he was alive here in Denver. And he would always say, whenever we talked about civil rights, he tended to not want to call it civil rights. He would tend to say that civil rights was the movement for the enlargement of democracy. And I think the reason why he wanted to really say that in a very unequivocal language is to remind us that civil rights is not, quote unquote, just for Black people. Civil rights is for all people. It's for our American democracy. And it was a model of how to enlarge democracy to continue to include more and more of our people in the participation and the benefits of living in a free society. So it's sort of a comment, but I'm wondering if either one of you would like to maybe build upon that a little further. But that was the first thing that really came to my mind towards the end of your remarks. I really was very moved by. We really must really be very mindful of that, because the other issue for me as a political scientist, and I'm sure you know this, we are the most politically sectarian since the 60s. I mean, all the data is showing that. And as you just put it, Maya, and we are now so polarized. That's why I would just be curious how Elijah Cummings would deal with this sort of polarized political climate that we're now living in. And I think many people are getting tired of this sort of, and I use the word actually sectarian to really make it even more clear what we're experiencing. It's very paralyzing to people. So even with an election, 81 million people who voted for Biden and Harris. I'm starting to get the sense from people even now that people are not understanding, to use the words of Frances Mary Berry, you have to vote and then keep showing up. I cannot, I don't mean to get too preachy, but I cannot underscore that enough. That we cannot just merely say, well, we went out and we voted, we got through this election, and now we can just sort of go back to what we were doing. We cannot afford to do that. So it's a mixture of a question and more commentary. So let me stop there.
Well, I'll just say this. We're experiencing asymmetrical political warfare here in the United States of America. The Republican Party has basically determined that power is their ultimate value. It turns out that it's not. They used to say that they believed in personal responsibility, they believed in fiscal responsibility, they believed in patriotism, they believed in the Constitution, they believed in our democracy. And it turns out that none of those things they believe in. And so what they ultimately believe in is power and maintaining an advantage in our political system, even though their political agenda is not the majority opinion in this country. And they're doing it so that they can try to, of course, drive their agenda and all that means in terms of the shape and scope of what our society is and what it will be. And if we're not careful, what our nation will look like in another 25, 30 years, I think, is apartheid South Africa. If that nature of what they're looking to turn our society into actually becomes prevalent. meaning that we have a majority society that's Black and brown, but controlled by a white supremacist political structure. So that being said, let me just say this, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jim because I've been talking way too long. And that is that absolutely civil rights is about all of our rights. It's not just about Black people. And as we've seen, we've got, LGBTQ populations, people of different religious faiths, people of different abilities, gender. I mean, we have all kinds of discrimination happening in this country. And we need to come to the realization that we need to recognize and that our fundamental and common humanity is non-negotiable. That is not up for political discussion. Neither are our rights. And so with that, we've got to make this about, how we get to a fair and free democracy that works for all people.
I'll add a couple thoughts from my experiences in talking with Elijah, because we are clearly at an intersection, inflection point where everything is riding on what happens in the next several days, weeks, and years. And it could be a devastating time, or it could be a time of change and promise. And often when I would talk to Elijah during a difficult period of a difficult week or hearing that he had been through, or a piece of news that had come out, I would end the session by saying, on a personal level, I'd say, so Elijah, are you optimistic or pessimistic? Because he was, had an abiding belief and faith in democracy. And he often would say, as time went on, he'd say, I am optimistic. Eventually, I think we're going to get through this. Now, remember the time frame. We're talking about basically 2019, and some pretty awful things that were going on then. Not, as it turned out, not as awful as they were to become. But he said, I am optimistic that we'll get through it, but it's going to be very rocky, very rougher than anybody knows, anybody can imagine. That's speaking of being prescient. That was pretty amazing to look into the future in that way. But he had this sort of abiding optimism that democracy would prevail. And that's why I say we're at this point that is so important. And just yesterday and today, I saw something that, I keep thinking I want to say, well, I want to look at this through Elijah's eyes. Where's the optimism? We went through this awful January 6th. We survived. I guess that's the democracy prevailed. I guess that's the good part. We had an impeachment. There were enough crossover votes to make it at least somewhat bipartisan. Okay. Then yesterday, I saw statistics on popularity of the Biden-Harris presidency, vice presidency. And as you well know, it's very hard in America to get a very high score, even in the best of times. And as you well know, Trump managed to consistently have a very low score in the low 40s. I mean, maybe bumped up to 45 and down to 39, but he sort of hovered around 40, 41%. That became his number. And as of yesterday, the Biden-Harris administration had a 62% approval. In some other, you got a 62% score in school, nobody got excited. But in terms of presidential and vice presidential popularity, because they're being sane and reasonable and inclusive, and within that number, over 10% of the positive approvals came from Republicans. So there was this glimmer that maybe some people were saying, I'm willing to open my mind a little bit. So I'm not jumping for joy and saying, look, it's all going to be fine. I'm saying, if we seize the moment, if we move ahead, if we do the right things, we can make some progress. we can avoid what happened in the, you know, in the post-Civil War days, and not the immediate, but you know what happened in the 1877. There is hope.
Yeah, there's a question here, and I just want to quickly respond by saying that that's important to know. I mean, I think what in a very, very sort of what I'm thinking about on a very sort of very practical level is what I think what Biden exemplifies is empathy. And we use that word quite a bit, I realize, but I think that's perhaps why the approval rating is so high, because I think for all that happened last year, the election, Joe Biden managed to model and was very authentic about empathy and wanting to try and bring the country together. So I think that quality, which I think is the core of sort of a moral compass, is what we all need to cultivate towards each other. We have to keep working at that skill of learning how to show empathy to people. And I know I'm pushing this conversation pretty hard because I am desperate that we break this political sectarian nature of our society. It's really important that we do that. So how do we do that? Well, my point is on this very sort of very personal level, how to cultivate empathy towards others. So I just wanted to sort of just say that. There's a question here from Jane. Let me go ahead and read it to the two of you. Let's see. So it's sort of still building on what we're talking about here. Where does this politically polarized society leave us in terms of democracy? Where do we go from here in terms of this two-party narrative, where this current generation may not be in full support of either part? Is a great question. It's sort of getting at, I think, perhaps, I think a lot of Americans, as two of you may or may not agree, people are really pretty unhappy with either political party. And because they opt out of the process. So that's sort of my build on that. I'm sort of curious what you all think about that.
So who was that? Oh gosh, what's her name? Elaine. What's Elaine's last name? She said, you don't have the luxury of opting out. And I so believe that we have no luxury of sitting back and saying, you know, I can't stand politics. I don't want to get involved. That is a surefire way to, you know, basically end up with a country none of us can live in. And with political parties, none of us can stand. What I am arguing is that we have to bum rush the system, you know, and I see that, you know, you're going to get to a question from a high schooler. Everybody needs to be involved, you know, and I don't care, you know, whatever your perspective is. If you don't like it, pick one that's the most compatible with your views and work it. Get them to change their opinion at the local level. And then you get the locals to change their opinions at the state level and then the national level. You know, just look at what's happening in Georgia. Stacey Abrams, people like LaTosha Brown were able to mobilize people like nobody's business. And they came out in record numbers, and they actually not just took down Donald Trump in Georgia, a red state, historically red state. They also took down two of the state's Republican senators. Now, if that isn't power, you tell me what power is. That is power. Now, guess what and by the way, the state election officials, in response to Donald Trump saying that the state of Georgia cheated somehow and that he wanted them to find all those votes for him, they said that, look, you know, this was a fair and square election. There was no fraud. And yet, more than 15 bills have been introduced in the state legislature by Republican state representatives to basically make it harder to vote now after this last election. And they're doing so absolutely because they're afraid of the power of the Black and brown communities, especially the Democrats who came out and upended the politics of Georgia. So what we're facing across the country are these reactionary, regressionist politics. And we can't just sit back and on the sidelines and just let this happen. This has to be challenged. This has to be challenged at every level of government because it's happening at every level of government. And if you don't want racism to prevail, if you don't want sexism to prevail, if you don't want people that hold intolerant views across the board to prevail in their efforts to take our society backwards, that means that you've got to be involved. You don't have the luxury of not liking the system. Now, one thing I want to end on is that, you know, you can say you don't like it, but you got to change it. But the other thing is that some of this is changing on its own. You know, I've been fascinated to read about Republicans saying that they're trying to start another, who don't agree with Donald Trump, that they're trying to start another party. I think that there are some dialectical elements that will happen here that none of us can anticipate. And maybe, you know, even there will be a splintering of the Democratic Party at some point. I'm not sure. But what I do say is that you must be involved.
You cannot. We saw today, I guess yesterday, that it looks like David Perdue is going to run against Raphael Warnock. You can't sit back and say, "Well, we won it." We won it for the moment. But if you want to hold on to the moment and perpetuate the moment, you cannot say, "Okay, I'm going to opt out. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to take a breather." I had personally had an enormous, exhausting argument with somebody close to me prior to the election, who I said I couldn't believe that this person could possibly vote for Donald Trump, and I didn't put it to him. I didn't ask because I was afraid of what I'd find out. But he proceeded to tell me all the terrible things about Trump. But, and I knew it was leading to a but he said, but, you know, look at the choice we have. He said, you know, this Biden, you know, he's so old, and rather than defend Biden, I said, okay. He said, and this person said to me, you know, Harris may be okay, but, you know, she's going to be the vice president, you know. And he said, this guy's so old and he's been around. So instead, I was trying to think, well, what could I say? So I said, well, okay, fine, I'm not going to defend him. I happen to like him, but I'm not going to defend him. I like her. I'm not going to defend her. You have a binary choice unless you stay home. And your choice is democracy or no democracy. And I think I might have gotten somewhere, but I was, you know, it was the only thing I could think of to say. It's what Maya said, you know, you don't have that luxury. And somebody else said, you know, I guess Obama said, we're not looking for perfect people. We're looking for the best people. You know, you want to find flaws in these candidates. It's not hard, but come down, be real, for God's sakes, you know. Mm-hmm. Pick the one you can live with and who will be best for the country. We've
got 2 minutes left according to our clock, and maybe this would be a great final question from Narissa, one of our young folks here. What words of encouragement and or inspiration can you give our young people of color?
Maya.
That's a great final question.
So you're absolutely the future. And Elijah believed it so much that he wrote this book for you. One of the two main goals of the book was to encourage and inspire young people. And the other one was to warn the American people about Donald Trump. And the reason he wanted to inspire young people is because he wanted his life story to be a testimony. He was born African-American in the Jim Crow South at a time when the nation turned its back on African-Americans and other people of color. He overcame, being labeled special education, coming from a very poor family, to basically rise to do everything that he rose to do. And he wants to encourage young people like you that you have a destiny, you have a future, but you have to make it happen. You have to keep your eyes literally on your prize and keep forging forward, overcoming the obstacles, not becoming so discouraged that you drop out of life or think that you can't do it. But but to become encouraged and strengthened after every challenge that you face. And so he so believed in you that he wrote this book as your bridge to your future. And so, you know, I just say, go forth. And he had a phrase that he always used. It says, our children are the living messages we send to a future we will never see. He considers you a message to the future. And so that with that, you know, I just say, I encourage you, I applaud you, and I admire you because I know you're going to do it.
And it's 6:01. And if I could just end with, first, of course, to thank the two of you for allowing us to have time to be with you. It's always just energizing to get re-energized and re-inspired to keep doing the good work that we all need to do. I'm holding in my hand here a book by Dr. Vincent Harding about Martin Luther King, and then the subtitle, The Inconvenient Hero. And at the very end of the book, he talks about all of these folks: Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dolores Huerta, Ann Barton, Martin Luther King. And what Dr. Harding is trying to say, that all of these people made a decision to not let the culture tell them to give into fear and to give into hopelessness and to fear and to deny their best possibilities. And the last line of this book is one of my favorite lines. I like to always quote from Dr. Harding to end talks like this, is that we are the ones we've been waiting for. I mean, that, I remember when he said that to me when he was alive, and I didn't quite appreciate what he meant. He would always end every conversation with that line. So I think that's just a very, very powerful way. All of you who are listening, you're the ones we're waiting for. This book is for you. This talk is for you so that you can be empowered and inspired to do the next steps of our work to enlarge our democracy. So I think I'm trying to honor the time. It's 6:03, so I'm trying to be a good moderator. And thank you so much, Maya, and thank you, Jim, so much for coming tonight. And I'm not sure if I need to turn it back over to James, but I'll stop there. And once again, really thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hudson.
We thank you very much for having us.
Absolutely.